Hello, I'm David Waumsley. Thanks for joining me. This talk is about intrinsic web design and its impact on page builders. For the longest time, web design has borrowed its approach from print design in that a project is typically conceived in a graphics design program. Instead of going off to the printers, the web project is turned into HTML and CSS, often with a WYSIWYG, or what you see is what you get, page builder. The problem is that unlike print, web designers have almost no control over what the user actually sees. And this became obvious when the first mobiles appeared, and this made us have to remake our websites, and it marked the end of the first wave of WYSIWYG page builders such as Dreamweaver, Go Live, Expression Web, and similar. These were, of course, replaced by today's more sophisticated builders, which, among other things, helped us to accommodate common mobile sizes using media queries. But now we have more than 2,000 unique viewport sizes, new device types, some without color or even screens. We've got new user preferences, letting our users choose their own web experiences. And significantly, CSS and browsers have been almost entirely refactored to encourage us to style around the way that HTML content works, instead of trying to force pixel perfection on a medium that was never suited to it. So what does this mean for the future of page builders? Well, there's a lot in that. So I'm going to try and break this up into 4 sections. First, the changes and new demands on website builders. What is intrinsic design? What's a page builder? And what could an intrinsic builder look like? Mostly, I'm going to be referring to what's coming out of the W3C. And for those who don't know, the W3C, or World Wide Web Consortium, is a public interest non-profit organization that was set up by the web's inventor, Sir Tim Berners-Lee. And through consensus, it sets web standards. Its working groups bring together major players such as Google, Apple, Microsoft, Adobe, as well as other independent experts. And I'd say ultimately what happens there impacts all page builders eventually, but often this is delayed by many years as page builders tend to focus on what web design beginners think they need, as opposed to what the W3C has to concentrate on, which is what the web and its users need. I'm going to refer to presentations from various W3C experts, but rather than spell out all their contributions to the web, I'm just going to link to this URL, which is noscript, all one word, .show/PB S8. And this is a show that I do with Nathan Wrigley, who's the co-host of the Page Builder Summit. And I guess it comes out of our own awareness as WordPress fanatics that we'd lost touch with the wider direction of the web. I guess it's for those who are serious about front-end web work, but equally we're trying to promote HTML and CSS as a free standard that anyone can use to create their own websites without the need for third-party dependencies. Our content is guided by what's coming out of the W3C and web standards. So we're not serving anyone's commercial interest with this show. It's a mixture of chats, some tips, and our attempts to do some practical building of some sites, demo sites. Anyway, let me move on to the first section, which is what are the changes and new demands? I would say since 2017, we've been seeing one of the biggest changes since the beginning of the web with the start of browser interoperability. So this is an agreement by the major browser vendors to coordinate the support of new code features. There's still competition amongst them, but what they've recognized is that these ongoing browser wars that they've had since the beginning have really held back the web. So now that they're working towards a shared goal, they've pushed the boundaries on what even they thought was possible with browsers, which in turn has made HTML and CSS extremely powerful in only a few short years, and there's loads more to come. But demand wise, I think it's still early days on this, but we're seeing a shift towards giving users more control over their web experiences through device and browser settings. So we're seeing preferences for things like light and dark mode, for no or reduced motion, for forced colors, for those people who want to use high contrast themes for their experience of the web, seeing reduced transparency and reduced data to help save people their bandwidth with connectivity issues as well. So with all of these things, they are things that we might need to sort of technically build it into our designs as users begin to expect these. I think they're starting to expect light and dark mode already. But I guess more pressing is having to support over 2,000 unique viewport sizes. So the idea that we once may have had to have pixel perfection created at different breakpoints is kind of out of the window at this moment. We're seeing the web appear on fridges, on our wearables, watches, glasses, on black and white Kindles. So we're now having to support monochrome right up to the new P3 color gamut, which is much wider than our graphics design program support at the moment. We're seeing smart speakers where there's no screen at all. And if anyone's been doing this for a little while, you probably see that our sites need to be a little faster loading. They need to be lighter, so they are greener. They need to be accessible, which is one of the key features of the web. It can reach everybody. And less spoken about is that it needs to be international, able to adapt to non-Western languages, which is actually a very quick fix. We stop using top, bottom, left, right, and we use block and inline, start and end. And that means if we do things like that, when someone goes with Google Translate and turns it to a right to left or a vertical language, our design should move with that one because we're using these logical properties. But anyway, the point is that there is at the moment a big push to support the W3C's, I think, long-held aims to have the web for all and on everything, not just for fully able Westerners on a handful of devices, which is what it's been like for most of the time. So in order to do that, we have to get back to the content or HTML first origins of the web. So many will look at this CSS meme as an amusing example of all that's wrong with CSS. But as Miriam, Suzanne and others point out, this is a feature, not a bug. Regardless of what visual control a designer might want, the browser must protect the content for the user. And the control is delusional anyway. In terms of authoring styles, we come third after the browser's own styles and whatever the user decides is their own styles. So if they use forced colors and we say a paragraph should be red, we're not going to get red. They win out over us. So I think in order to give everybody a good experience, we have to start flipping our approach and start styling around the way that web content actually works in the real world, which leads me on to what is intrinsic web design. Well, it's a term that was coined by Jen Simmons in a talk in 2018 called Everything You Know About Web Design Just Changed. It's not a standard as such, but the W3C promote the principles that underpin the term intrinsic design. And intrinsic is used because it's really saying that we need to start playing to the strengths of the web by using directly the material of the web, HTML and CSS, rather than looking backwards to other mediums. Now, her presentation takes an historical look at the long-running tension there has been from those who see the web as it was intended, essentially as an information sharing tool, and visual designers like Jen herself who want it to be beautiful. And as soon as we got the web, then there was a commercial demand to use it as a marketing tool with all the visual sophistication of print. And this often undermined the inclusive power of the web. So if we look at Jen's timeline, we start to see that we have flow only in the first place, which is perfectly responsive and accessible. We can see this on the first ever website, which is still there. It works, but of course it's not going to sell many burgers. So we begin to mess with it and we get HTML tables, which destroys accessibility. Reading through all those tables is no good for a screen reader. We get Adobe's Flash, which did the same with accessibility. It wasn't very easy searchable. It was very, very cool, but if everybody had gone that way, we would have sort of lost the public gift that was given to us all, this shared web. It would have gone to kind of private hands. And I think at the time, given the browser wars and the inconsistencies amongst browsers, it's not surprising that Flash would be popular because it gave control to devs. And I think similar could be said of the JavaScript first solutions like Facebook's React. But both of these potentially hamper the browser's ability to evolve the web in line with the user's needs. So equally, it's not surprising that the W3C give us HTML web components as an alternative to React, and that they're rapidly moving the kind of front-end JavaScript that impacts on content and the functionality of that into HTML and CSS, where it can't break, which it will do with JavaScript under certain circumstances. Anyway, back to the timeline. Semantic HTML won out in the end, but there still continued to be frustrations with styling, and we started to see CSS frameworks. Ideally, content should remain fluid, but when you're trying to create columns and you've only got percentage values as we did then, and floats, and a hack, which we use the clear fix hacks to get to the next row, it all got a little bit difficult. It got mathematically complex because we have the box model, something that we don't need to worry about so much these days, but we have to allow for padding, margin, and the borders around every element and calculate those. But for visual designers, it all became a bit too much because they would design fluidly in their viewport size. Somebody would see that wider and it would open up all of these kind of gaps and look kind of ugly and uneven and unprofessional. So many of them went back to frameworks like the 960 grid system, which would then contain everything within that and line everything up beautifully. But of course, as soon as we got the iPhone and that became popular with its 320 pixel width screen, that was kind of out of the window, and we entered the era of responsive design. And even as we did that, moving towards the 2010s, people already knew in the W3C we needed what Jen calls a flexibility model for the web. And we partly got that with an early version of Flexbox. And Flexbox uses the browser's ability to do maths on the fly, and one-dimensionally will take a bunch of elements of different sizes and return the best layout for those elements based on the size that the browser has available. So it does all of the work rather than us having to calculate. And it allowed page builders to bring in drag and drop because everything would drop into place there and help with some basic mobile responsiveness. However, most of us kind of missed the power. I mean, it's rolled out in a kind of awkward way anyway, and our clients still wanted pixel perfection. So we tended to set fixed units on Flexbox, kind of destroying its unique power, I guess, according to our breakpoints. That's pretty much where a lot of us are still there, because today's page builders were built round Flex, and we still tend to work and design with the idea of these one-dimensional rows. But since 2017, we've had browser support for CSS Grid, really the first comprehensive layout system for the web. It's two-dimensional, and combined with the Flexbox strengths and our new abilities to set the min and max parameters and do calculations between them on elements, we now have this flexibility model for the web that allows us to work to all four corners of the viewport. So Jen's presentation shows some of our experiments that she'd been doing at that time on making everything flexible to those four corners and making squishy, as she says. The key point, though, of her talk is that we now have the styling tools to make the web beautiful as she would like without having to compromise the content. But we do have to work with the way that browsers handle content, rather than what we previously have done is to force static and try and make the CSS work around that. It's worth looking at Jen's talk and some of her layout land stuff, but there's also a couple of other talks which I recommend. Andy Bell's Be the Browser's Mentor, Not Its Micromanager, that looks at how modern CSS we can give parameters to a browser and let it do the calculations first to present the best layout for the user's own device and needs. And another one that I think is worth watching is Matthias Ott's Web Design Engineering with new CSS, which was from last year, but will bring us more up to date on what there is in CSS and why we might want to start thinking more about designing in the browser or sort of combination of the two. So these are kind of update, and I think they help with get to the new mindset because it is flipping everything that we used to think about web design. So let's talk about what a page builder is now. So I guess it's whatever we decide it is, it's just names. But I think typically it's been seen as a visual tool that helps people to create web pages with no code knowledge. And at the CSS Day conference in 2017, Bert Boss and Hakan Willem-Lee, the creators of CSS, did a session, and they were asked in the Q&A at the end by someone who I think was a lecturer teaching web design in universities. He asked about the possibility of better visual tooling for CSS, as many of his designer students started to sweat at the sight of code, which I'm sure a lot of us can relate to. Unsurprisingly, though, Hakan Willem-Lee's response was that the WYSIWYG model doesn't really work and shouldn't work. There are too many devices and possible outcomes to view them all simultaneously. We have to understand how the web works at the code level, and the W3C's job has been to try and make that CSS as easy and as logical as possible, but it needs to be taught right. So if we agree with him here, then a better direction for page builders might be to become the tools that help people understand and work with code rather than try and avoid it. And I think many are moving that direction anyway. But there is also a newer way to avoid code, which I can't ignore, which is AI. So this is really heavily hyped at the moment, the idea of vibe coding, where you just prompt what you want and you get it. And it is truly amazing to watch. And it's good in its place. I mean, it's good for creating minimal viable products, for creating your own personal apps when it's using code that's imperative, that's hard to do. But I think when it comes to most public websites, we have to remember that this is a large language machine which has been trained on a large data set of old and bad ways to do things. We really do need to understand the code it produces, or we risk creating a vanity project that looks good to us but frustrates or even discriminates against other web users. Now, I think most of the products actually limit the data that AI has access to. I noticed there are some WordPress folks who have been looking at things like Lovable and Bolt. These are two products which they restrict it to React JS and Tailwind CSS. And they were looking at it as a possible front end to a WordPress backend. But the thing is with these is that they are JavaScript solutions. They put React JavaScript first. So if your JavaScript, as it does, breaks in your browser, there is no website. But the key thing is really you need ongoing maintenance for this. So if the same can be achieved with HTML and CSS, which it often can be, it makes no sense for a non-coder to take on the responsibility for the security of even more complex code that has little chance of outliving HTML and CSS. You're going to be bound up to this dependency on other things just to keep your site working, where HTML and CSS, it will probably just live on forever. Recently, Canva, the online graphics design program, which is very cool, but they've been promoting their future AI-powered builder, which will work in the same way, I think. I mean, no doubt it's going to be an improvement on the output of their present builder, which they've got, which returns non-semantic HTML. So for me, I don't see the point unless you just want visuals. And in that case, why not put up a PDF? But I don't see with any of these, even with a big company like that, that any of these make it easy for people to meet the requirements of the European Accessibility Act, which is coming in. And their own marketing sites fail on this, so they will legally need to do something about that. So I don't think it's a priority of them. And I will also link to an article by Alex Russell called The Reckoning, which looks at how a JavaScript first approach broke US public services. Everybody jumped onto that as, you know, a way to do things much more quickly with React. And this is a cautionary tale of the problems of ignoring the W3C's rule of least power for short-term gain. I think we also have to recognize that HTML and CSS are a type of declarative language which has very much unlike traditional imperative coding languages for computers, which also include PHP and JavaScript. I recommend a talk by Jeremy Keefe called Declarative Design, which talks about how declarative and imperative languages require different skill sets from us. So it's very difficult to be a front and a back end person all in one. I certainly couldn't do it. Both of these are technically programming languages. They need a computer, but unlike the imperative languages, which give full control, but will break if our logic is wrong, HTML and CSS are forgiving. Code things badly, the browser will ignore what it doesn't understand and serve everything that it can. It makes it a lot easier to work with, but we only get to suggest or hint what the browser does. Its job is to serve users, and as mentioned earlier, the user can overwrite anything that we say on this. And this is good because it means that browsers and user devices can evolve with the web without breaking what we previously coded. And that's the beauty of HTML first. Also, I think most of us, I'm guessing in this audience, are using our soft skills and our creativity, which AI is poor at. We communicate through the browser, through HTML and CSS, which requires judgment at every level. So when we're working with HTML, it's up to us to judge whether content should be tagged as a section, a div, an article, or a site. There are guidelines on this, but there aren't absolute rules because it depends on the context. It needs humans to be able to make those judgments in context to what they're trying to communicate to others and against other things in the real world. Same will happen as well with, we should be putting alt text on our images for screen readers. Sometimes we make the decision to leave that blank and treat it as a decorative thing because it doesn't need to be mentioned again. Sometimes we will need to write something in there, but we're not likely to want to do what AI would naturally do, which is literally describe what is on the image. Usually that image represents something, and that's what the screen reader needs. Same happens when it comes to layout. As soon as you get to the first stage of that, which display mode you set responsively and how that works is different. You will have to decide. It's not a technical consideration, but one that requires the priority of the information that you're dealing with and how you want that to line up. So there's a human element that's needed to the front end. So I think we're most safe from being replaced by AI, but I think AI is remarkable. I'm using it all the time. It's can be really effective in builders, I think, for manipulating with images that can be used there. But for me, it's particularly good because the W3C documentation is extremely thorough but wordy. But if you point AI at it and ask it a question and only to look at that one, it will give you some examples and some options which you can use. And you can use it to critically get feedback as well as fixes on your own site. So I think it's remarkable. But the other side of it as well is that front end folks like us, if we're for most websites, and they're fairly simple, we're just dealing with documents that we're styling with a few lines of CSS. We don't really need all that processing power. Page builders, I think, generally have been a thing where it's there for people to avoid code, maybe particularly CSS. And I noticed that Canva in their advertising make it clear they use somebody else's voice, a user's voice, to say that code is really difficult. But is it really? And that's the thing I want to hone in on this one, is that I don't think it is. I mean, traditionally, programmers hate on CSS because it doesn't give them the control they expect with their logical languages, but they often, because they haven't brought up with front end stuff, they fail to see the reason why CSS is the way it is. It is logical if you understand it, and most of them just bypass that. If they've got that background, they will put Tailwind on so they don't have to deal with the CSS. There are others like me who've learned to hate CSS, and that really comes down to the fact that the period of time we were taught it through a series of hacks and tricks to try and make it work like print when it really wasn't able to. And so that put me off. And I think right now, anyone who's trying to learn CSS, if they're doing it as I started off trying to do with YouTube videos and just various blog posts, it'll be even more difficult at the moment because everyone's occupied with the excitement that CSS is becoming more like a traditional programming language, able to replace JavaScript. And on the horizon, we have sort of really clever stuff, which is quite confusing: at function, inline if statements, trigonometry, SAS mixins, all that stuff, as well as some of the useful, easy stuff, which we might be able to use if you're a non-coder type, which is fully accessible CSS, only carousels, pop-ups and animation. With a few snippets, we can probably do a lot with that. But I think essentially the thing that caused the problem was web layout for most people, how to get started to lay out your pages. And this, thanks to CSS Grid and the efforts to rationalize everything into a logical system, means it's much easier. There is a great talk by Rachel Andrews, a bit heavy going, from 2019 called Refactoring the Way We Talk About CSS. And she shows how, with a basic understanding of normal flow, how that works with block and inline elements, if we take that and see how the different display properties like grid and flex change that, once we've got an understanding of that, all we need to understand is the alignment module in CSS, how we move those elements around our displays, and the sizing module to size things often fluidly these days. And from there, we've got an easy system. It's quite easy to teach. We just then have to add in some various components. So she can teach people, a newbie, to code their own websites in a day. And the people she says she struggles with are those people who have the long experience, really, because they've learned all these different hacks. And they've learned things which are less relevant today, things like collapsing margins and the box model. You don't really need to learn so much of that. But anyway, this leads me on to what is the last kind of builder that I think is growing at the moment, which is what a lot of people are calling the sort of professional builders. These seem popular, and it seems logical to me, particularly in WordPress, because there'll be a lot of visual designers who are trained on that, who might have gone to a WYSIWYG to move towards the web, only to find that that doesn't really represent the way web works, so they need to learn some CSS. But I think learning CSS through a builder UI adds an extra layer of complexity. It's a non-transferable skill of wrangling the builder's own set of icons and names. And it's a working environment that is always going to need to change as CSS change. So if you work in a code editor to learn it that way, you decide what goes in and out, and your environment stays the same. But here, the builder's kind of stuck when they do that, because they can't move something that is less used because of other users and backwards compatibility. So for example, I can't remember the last time I used a pixel or top, bottom, left and right, because it's replaced by logical properties. And also, you know, with the UI, you have to wait for them to be able to put things in. I think it took about 6 years for most builders to be able to put CSS Grid as part of their UI in there. And for me, it's even useless anyway, because I borrow by default the way that Rachel Andrews and Miriam Suzanne will write out their CSS Grid as ASCII art, which I think is visual in its own sense. So I find the builder more confusing. Also, I think there's an ecosystem around these builders for people learning CSS or wanting to get more professional, which is selling things like CSS frameworks, and they're promoting certain methodologies of the past, and that's fine because it's what professionals have been doing for the last 15 years. But coming from the WC3 perspective, those writing the spec right now know that things like frameworks and these methodologies are symptoms of a problem that they need to fix in native CSS. So the arrival of CSS Grid allowed Miriam Suzanne, who created the Suzy framework, to say, well, you don't need this anymore. We fixed it really in CSS, just use Grid. And then, I'm nothing against it. It can still be useful in certain circumstances, but we have to know that it is a class naming system that's there to deal with the difficulties some people have with the cascading style sheets in a component-based workflow. But the cascade is the power behind CSS. It lets us write less, where BEM, if you're using that by default, is going to make you write more. So rather than circumvent the C in CSS from the start, we can use other properties which we now have just come out to kind of solve this problem. We have where, we have scope and layers. All of them allow us in different ways to deal with any specificity issues that we might have. And I know that some people are cheering the fact that one of the biggest builders in WordPress now is finally moving to a class-based system, which is good because at least they're not doing it page by page. There's more logical thing with that. But even with something like that, class-based is not necessarily always the way to be starting. Esther Whale, who wrote the CSS Definitive Guide to Web Layout and Presentation with Eric Myers, huge great book, likes to write with no or as few class selectors as possible. You just use the already named HTML elements. And if you want to take that further, you can use nth child and not have any classes at all. So a better way to sort of connect with it is, I think, with the cascade and with the global styling using the already names out there. And then you treat your classes and everything else as an exception to that, but start from the beginning. So I think everybody needs some sort of methodology, some understanding about where they might put their CSS. But I think newer approaches like the inverted triangle by Harry Roberts or Cube CSS work in the way that CSS works. It just gives you a different idea about how you might just organize the structure of that. Okay, let me move on to my last section now, which is what would an intrinsic page builder look like? So we're off into fantasy land now, but it would, of course, encourage us to put HTML content first and style around the way it works responsively. If such thing was to exist, I think it would obviously collectively evolve. But here is my wish list, I guess, from someone who would be in the market for such a thing. So firstly, with managing code, as keen as I am to only use HTML and CSS and have no dependencies at all, I do need to let my clients grow their sites and blog on them. So I'm always going to need a way to be able to create and store global template areas like headers and footers and change them all from one place. I'm going to need a way to be able to insert code dynamically for updating the metadata or creating blog-like content with sort of loops or tags and categories, that kind of things. So when I started getting back maybe 18 months ago to HTML first approach, I used what I knew because I've been working with WordPress since 2007. I used it along with a code snippet plugin called WP Codebox, and then used that so I'd create my HTML in this, and I would dynamically insert that code into my pages with shortcodes and other things dynamically with custom fields. Recently, I've moved to Eleventy, which is a static site generator, where I do exactly the same, but instead of using PHP, this uses JS Node, and the custom fields just become front matter in that, but it's exactly the same. But both of these have pushed me beyond my skill sets because I'm not used to the imperative languages, but I could not find a builder which would take care of the dynamic language stuff and make that easy for me, but still leave the declarative languages of HTML and CSS. To me, it seems like all the available solutions seem to say that you're either a coder who knows all types of code, or you're a non-coder where you shouldn't be allowed to touch any of it. And my requirements are quite simple, but WordPress and Eleventy I particularly love working with at the moment. But what I do recognize about it, same with WordPress, is that in some ways they're all dependent on some other bits and pieces to keep it running together. So I'd be happy, as it's a kind of simple requirement I have, to be paying one company who I talk to and get support from. Okay, when it comes to marketing now, so page builders are typically, they attract beginners, and the only way that a beginner really can judge the quality of a builder is by what they see and how easy it looks to use it. And as such, the marketing for these things really play into personal vanity and kind of laziness. But I think marketing for a intrinsic page builder could do something more powerful by echoing the W3C's messaging about reaching everybody, whatever the device they're on, whatever ability that they have. And surely that is what most people who create websites want, over than creating a vanity project for themselves. And it could also play up to the fact that you, through this, learn web standards, use a transferable skill, not something that's just in today's builder, that will kind of empower you and you'll allow you to talk to other devs from any area. And it could save you money in the long run, which brings me to my next point about hosting. I think an intrinsic builder should make it easy to publish static sites as static sites, ideally connect up to things like GitHub for backup and version controlling, and in turn to be able to connect to free or at least very cheap hosting through things like GitHub, Netlify, Cloudflare, Google, and others have these. And according to the Web Almanac for 2024, there's been a 67% growth in static and hybrid website architectures amongst the top 10 100,000 most visited sites. Clearly, we're seeing a move that way. It's just ecologically better. And, over 90% of the client sites I've done, it really makes no sense for those sites to remain live dependent on millions of lines of complex code that I have no control over, that are updated by hundreds of people who I've never seen, and take on the stress of the extra maintenance, security and breakages that come with that, when I could just stick HTML up there, have it run faster, greener and not break, which I think is a marketing tool as well for the intrinsic. Of course, not all sites are like that, but I think it's the way to go. If it should be static, which most are, it should be displayed statically. Okay, and visual previews or canvas or whatever we call the area that we look at when we're in a page builder. I think an intrinsic builder would need to encourage creators to keep in mind the range of users they are designing for. And one example of this is in Silktide's accessibility extension, which allows you to see sites in monochrome. Useful if you've not underlined your link to break, if you're relying on color to tell people where to go, that you can kind of break a lot of things for people when you're going to black and white. It simulates other visual impairments. You can check color contrast, check the title and the tabbing order is in order. I mean, I hurt my hand at some point and just started tabbing through the web, and it was an absolute nightmare on most sites. And we can take one glance at the alt tags to see if they all seem logical in place on our pages, and see regions, something which I didn't even know the concept existed until recently. It's what non-sighted users on screen readers use to get an idea of the makeup of a page and be able to move around quickly on this. And also in Silktide, there is a basic screen reader. So I think it's always worth seeing how that might read out your screen. Ideally, the canvas as well would let you zoom in, because people do resize their fonts, and would let you maybe drag from the corner so you can move it into all sorts of sizes to represent the browsers that are out there. So building with HTML and CSS, really this is the big question. This is why I think we have page builders. How to make that code more attractive than no code. And I wish I had a second talk to cover this one, but hopefully a few examples will give you a sense of the direction that I think things could go. So firstly, with HTML, well, there's not really an issue there. I mean, people managed to write that with the first wave of WYSIWYG builders I did with Dreamweaver. You really only need 30 minutes to get it and able to alter maybe some templates that are there. With autocomplete tools, when you're writing it like Emmet, you barely have to write anything. It sort of self-completes for you, and then you can use AI, could be thrown in to help along the way. I think the issue has always been with the styling and the layout. That's what's there. And I think now this is the key. It's how CSS changed. Native CSS is increasingly becoming like a programming language, able to manage itself within its own style sheets, if you like. So, for example, I think we're already starting to see this. You may have seen some promoters on YouTube, people who promote page builders, recommending a fluid typography code generator over using the page builders interface. Now, I do the same. In my case, I'm using Utopia because of the people who support it, but the principle's the same whichever one you use. And what it does is it produces this quite mathematically complex CSS that hands the control, tells the browser what to do, and saves us generally work. We don't need to write it. We only need to understand what it does. And because we're copy and pasting, we're extracting it from the generator, there's no dependency on it. It's going to stay there in our style sheets and work. It means that the generator, when things change, and that generator has changed and evolved, it has no impact on the sites or the users. So we get around the technical debt, code bloat, user lock-in that comes with a lot of page builders, because we're just moving that in directly. Things can change there and we move it back. So I think generally this can be applied to everything. And I think there are good reasons not to try and do much with CSS as it's changing greatly, to systemize that into a UI, but rather than share it through snippets is a better way. So take color, for example. In the last year, a few years, we've seen the introduction of relative color, color mix, dark and light color functions, and a whole bunch of wider color spaces as well. And these offer a dynamic way within CSS to generate and control our colors. They've come so quickly to browsers that people are still experimenting with how some code generators might work with that and snippets on that. But it tells me it's probably better to be doing it through chunks of code than through a builder UI. I'm already using relative colors to automatically darken buttons on hover and for some transparency. So I can put that in the code. But what it's doing, instead of having to add another color to my palette at the top, I use relative colors, which let us split up the color space and do maths against it. So I can make this thing go darker, whatever the color is somewhere else. So if I change my whole theme, I've still got functionality. So when I hover over the button, it takes that color and makes it dark, whatever the color is. So it's a way of doing that dynamic programming. But I mean, you could take this to the whole extreme. I don't know how this is where people are trying to get into these generators. You could use it to create these whole color schemes, which you can use in one go and just change the whole look of everything. And again, the same thing I think applies to generators or recipes for layout. So there is what I discovered earlier on was Every Layout by Hayden Pickering and Andy Bell. And that got me started. And what they do is they provide a bunch of generators, HTML and CSS, to help with common layout patterns without the need for media breakpoints. So these are sort of truly intrinsic, and it inspired me to start my own collection of recipes. And essentially that's what I did on No Script Show. We built 3 sites on that one, and we'll do more later. They're not particularly fancy or challenging, but the thing is I'm just using my own pile of snippets for this. Basically it was the same with same code for each one of these, with some things have just been altered around and some values changed on this one. So the approach was actually, I think, faster than me trying to do the same with a page builder. And it's just as well, really, because I would be no good in a CSS challenge. I can't remember the syntax. It doesn't stick in my head, but really I don't need to. The key thing is that we just need to understand how the code works. So I'll give you a few examples of the snippets I use. So one I use is this RAM technique, as it's often called. It's a one-line piece of code in CSS Grid that creates a sort of automatically responsive grid that you might want for, say, groups of cards or in a blog, in a staff team page or something, when it will go to any numbers outwards and different cards and to one card when it's at the smallest. And with a bit of extra programming on this one-liner, I can have a reusable snippet where I have some built-in settings that restrict the number of columns that I want if I want it not to go beyond a certain amount with this one. So I don't need to understand the complexities here. I've suddenly got a UI within my own CSS, which I copy and paste it in this one. And you know, I did a video on it ages ago with my own page builder, trying to do exactly the same as this thing does in a Flexbox layout, and it is impossible really to overwrite the CSS that the builder was producing. So I think you know, that's snippets and generators are the way forward with that. There is another one that I use, which is known as fluid breakouts. It's been around for a long time, actually, but it's taken years for a lot of people to know about it. And it's using named grid lines in Grid. I mean, it wasn't designed with that in mind. People just work out great ways to be able to use it. And it's another responsive technique where it involves a lot of complex CSS because you kind of have to name up all the lines on your CSS, but it only requires us to change a few values. There is at least one generator out for this, and it's therefore, so normally if we want an element to break out of a smaller wrapper, say we have our text center aligned in a blog post, we want that to be tight so it's readable, but we might want certain bits of that to jump out of that. Well, we set up a name grid area, and with CSS then we can say, okay, this element, I'm going to give you this name, this class name, and then you'll move to a different place in the grid, and we can do it, and it all responsively moves in because it's all squidgy. And finally, just the thing that I mentioned earlier is about grid and the fact that it kind of is its own visual display, or I find it useful to do this. So assuming we don't want our grid boxes to overlap or to bend around corners, we can use this visual way to work with the grid. So we just set up our grid areas, and with this ASCII art, we can name things whatever we want. And we've got a way of visually templating this one, which I think is just as easy as learning any page builder. I think it's easier. Let me just mention quickly as well, the other thing that we'll need to build our websites is components. And again, I need another talk to go on the full range of components we're starting to see now, where we can essentially copy and paste. And as long as we have a small explanation of how it works, we can introduce new things there. I think the most exciting example of that is the work that's just been done by Adam Argyle as I'm recording this, where he's created some accessible JavaScript-free carousels. This is presently only supported in Chromium browsers, but it's likely to move to everyone. And it now seems funny to me that, when I started with modern page builders, how excited me and many others were about, the number of WYSIWYG components that you could have in your builder or your add-on pack to add in. But as time's passed, I think more people have moved to realize that, doing this is often a usability issue. We're just getting carried away with the wow factor. Accessibility issues come with the page speed. And it's not easy once they're created for a builder to be able to fix how they are working to the new method without breaking some sites. So it seems clear to me that the management of CSS should now probably be within CSS. So we need to get introduced to it, and that a builder of the future needs to use what it's often done very well, is to be able to create searchable templates and bring up things in your workflow as you need it. So I see that as the future. Anyway, that's enough from me. This is the end. I'm truly grateful if anyone has managed to make it with me to the end. I know a lot of this was controversial for a summit on page builders, but I hope you got something useful out of it. If you are interested in this kind of thing, then please do subscribe to the No Script Shows YouTube channel, where we'll be sharing what we learn as we kind of go on this journey. But anyway, thanks again for your time. Really appreciate it. Bye-bye.